Last week, I used the word miron, and I realized from the comments that there were some people who were not familiar with the word. It is a borrowed Tagalog word. I mean, it was borrowed from Spanish. It comes from the Spanish verb mirar, which means to watch or to look at. In its neutral sense, it simply means someone who is looking or observing. Now, you might be wondering, what has this got to do with our readings today? A lot. Did you know that Christianity spread like a wildfire in the first century, all because St. Paul took seriously the Mirons? Sino ba ang mga Miron? Who were the Mirons in the first century, you might want to ask? Well, we heard about them in today's reading, or first reading. They were the outsiders during the Sabbath Jewish services. In the first century, meron dalawang klaseng audience, two kinds of audiences in the Jewish synagogues. You know, the synagogues are the ancient equivalents of our parish churches today. So two kinds of audience. On the one hand, there were the insiders. And who were the insiders? Well, they were those who were counted as regular members of the synagogue community who were Jewish by ethnicity, circumcised males from age 13 and above. Only those were allowed inside. On the other hand, there were the outsiders. And these are the ones I call the Mirons. They are not Jewish from birth, even if they show interest in the Jewish faith and even attend regular synagogue services. You know, strictly speaking, they are categorized as Gentiles or Greeks. But they are practically Jewish already by faith, minus the ethnicity, because they have been attending synagogue worship. Sometimes they are referred to by different names in the Acts of the Apostles. They are called the God-fearing Gentiles, or the Gentile converts, or the proselytes, meaning they're not ordinary Gentiles anymore. They're converts to Judaism. But, you see, Judaism tended to be very exclusive. It was never a missionary kind of faith. They did not really go out of their way to convert people or to welcome them into their religion. And since their religion was at the same time their ethnicity, even long-time converts to their faith remained as outsiders. They never really got integrated among the insiders. At most, the insiders in the synagogue community constructed an outward corridor for them, meaning the insiders are inside the synagogue and they have corridors outside, and the outsiders, the Mirons, they could only stand at the corridors and sort of eavesdrop, you know. The corridors were called the courtyard of the Gentiles. But they remained segregated, etchapuera pa rin sila, from the mainstream insiders. Kumbaga sa exclusive clubs, one might say today, only card-holding members are allowed inside. Why? Because they were not Jewish from birth. They were not circumcised. They were not disposed to observe the Sabbath. Alam nyo yung no work on Sabbath, that's something that the Gentiles detested. And the Jewish customs like, you know, kosher, food regulations, what is clean and unclean. But ironically, despite the snobbishness of the Jewish faith, it tended to attract many Gentiles, many Greeks. The Greek temples kasi, they had gods and goddesses, but they did not have sacred books. That's where Judaism was special. It had a special appeal because they had sacred scriptures. And therefore, Judaism was considered as a very educated, very highly literate, and wisdom-oriented kind of religion. You won't believe this. According to historians, at some point during the 1st century, there were more non-Jews who were attending the synagogue than the mainstream Jews. More outsiders than insiders. You know, I saw something like this only in Singapore, in the Novena Church. You know, the parish priest asked me, you know, Bishop, you probably don't realize that the people attending this Mass, only around 60% of them are Catholics. He said, I was surprised to find out that even Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists were attending because many of them felt that Mary was a powerful intercessor. But anyway, it's the same thing, the mirons and the insiders. And the outsiders showed greater interest in the preaching of the rabbis than the actual regular participants did. Well, perhaps because the regular members had become so familiar with the services. Di ba kasabihan natin, familiarity breeds contempt. Many of them were not even paying attention anymore. They tended to take it for granted that they were already saved because they were legitimate children of Abraham and they fulfilled their religious duties and obligations. But it was different with the Mirons. They were there not because they were fulfilling a duty or obligation. They were sincerely curious about the sacred scriptures. And when they listened, they were very attentive. Why? Well, because they did not belong. Even if they had been attending synagogue worship for many years, they were still unqualified for inclusion into the mainstream. And somehow, they felt the need to prove themselves that they could be more devout than the ethnic Jews themselves. You know, what about St. Paul? St. Paul was in principle an ethnic Jew, an insider. He was even educated by the Pharisees. Luke tells us that whenever St. Paul visited a city, his first destination was the synagogue. He would join the local Jewish community in their Sabbath services and public worship. And he was even invited as a guest preacher because he was educated by the Pharisees. However, whenever Paul inserted into his preaching anything about Jesus of Nazareth, the insiders were turned off. Because Christianity became for them what we might today call a conversation stopper. They treated St. Paul and the early Christians suspiciously, like promoters of a strange cult or sect. St. Luke tells us that at some point, Paul got tired of being rejected by the insiders. What did he do? He turned to the outsiders, the Gentiles who were eavesdropping on the corridors. And when he saw that he had a bigger audience among these mirons waiting in the courtyard who were more genuinely interested in what he was saying about Jesus, he turned his attention to them instead. And what is amusing in the story of St. Luke is that one of the serious mirons was living just next door to the synagogue, and his name was Titus Justus. Not only would he welcome St. Paul into his house, some of the insiders, mainstream Jews, would choose to get out of the synagogue and listen to Paul in the house of Titus Justus. Naging karibal pa ng synagogue. And they would eventually form what would later be called an ecclesia katoikon in Greek, or the house churches. These, my dear friends, were the beginnings of the Christian church. They were private homes that were extended to welcome other brothers and sisters. They were the original exemplars for what today we call BEC, Basic Ecclesial Community, before they grew into large parishes. Sometimes I ask myself, was St. Paul being simply innovative in his strategy for evangelization? My answer to that is not really. He was just following the way of Jesus. You remember, Jesus himself took the temple outsiders seriously, the tax collectors, sinners, the outcasts during his time. But as a consequence, he was treated like an outsider himself. And that is why he died outside the city, at the dump site of Jerusalem, which was called Golgotha. In the gospel today, Jesus says, "A little while and you will not see me." Meaning, he would disappear because he would be rejected and executed outside the city like a criminal. But he says, "In a little while again, you will see me." Meaning, he will return and bring a lot of people with him to conversion. His rejection will bring about the redemption of many outsiders, the last, the least, and the lost, whom he will seek out for inclusion into the family of the children of God. In short, what he is saying here is, my disappearance will make you grieve, but my return will bring about redemption and will turn your grief into joy. My dear friends out there, I do not know where you are following this online Mass from, what part of the world. I know that many of you who have become regular followers of this online Mass were not even regular church-going parokyanos before. Isn't it strange that the Lord has used this pandemic as an opportunity to reach all of you so that He could be present in your homes, to nourish you constantly with His Word, and to make you grow from church mirons to His beloved friends and companions in His mission.